When Daniel Moore came home from service, he expected memories waiting at his red-gabled house in Pine Hollow. Instead, he found Rex, the German Shepherd, Max, the Doberman, and Duke, the Rottweiler, huddled together in the frost, their bodies thin, their eyes broken. Why had they been abandoned? Who had left scars beneath their coats? Each answer drew him closer to a fight against cruelty itself. Watch as truth unravels along the quiet streets and the waters of Crystal Lake. Like and subscribe if you believe loyalty deserves protection and love must always win. Michael Grant eased the old Ford onto the shoulder and shut the engine down like a man closing a chapter he didn't trust to stay shut. The night in Pine Hollow, Colorado had a way of sitting heavy on the land pine resin in the air, a bare winter moon climbing the foothills, every porch light, a small declaration that someone inside was trying to make sense of another day. He sat a moment with his hands on the wheel, working a stiffness out of his knuckles that the core had left behind like a calling card. The dash clock read 10:17. The heater ticked as it cooled. He watched his breath fog the windshield and then fog and fade, as if the truck were practicing how to keep going. He had not told anyone he was back. Not the men at the VFW who still sent him holiday cards. Not the neighbor who used to snow-blow his sidewalk. Not even Rachel, whose voice he could conjure with painful accuracy in the blue hours when sleep thinned and memories got brave. He'd told himself it was because he wanted to avoid ceremony. Truth was, he wanted a clean read on the life he'd left behind. If you arrive quietly, you see what things are when they think you're not looking. He rolled back onto Maple Street, the tires humming over familiar seams in the asphalt, and let the truck idle at the curb in front of the bungalow he had once painted the color of a summer robin's egg because Rachel loved cheerful things. The paint had faded to a softer blue, now edges chalky where hail and time had nibbled at it. The porch light burned a steady yellow. Wind pushed through the junipers along the fence and made a low shushing sound like a nurse in a ward asking the world to be kind. He stepped down. Gravel shifted. His boots, the same pair he'd worn through 2 duty stations and 1 funeral, sank a fraction into the frost, and the cold reached up to remind him that this state did not cut deals with November. He reached the bottom step before he saw what was tucked into the small pool of light the porch offered. 3 shapes, tight as a single thought pressed together against the wooden door. For a beat, he thought they might be yard debris, wind-tossed carpet scraps, the mind grasping at the harmless. Then one of them lifted its head. Eyes caught light and paled. Ears quivered. The shape uncurled in slow increments, careful as an old man getting out of bed. Buddy Michael said, and the word came out more air than voice. He didn't remember deciding to kneel, only the ache in his knees when he did, and the cold in the porch boards seeping through denim. The shepherd was the first to separate from the huddle sable coat dulled to a hard brown one ear, nicked in a way he did not recognize, as if a story had been written on the dog, while Michael was learning to measure time by chow lines and flight schedules. The shepherd's eyes gold when the sun caught them just right. He remembered, looked up into his face, and then away, the way animals do when they carry a ledger of things done and things endured. The Doberman eased a narrow head over the shepherd's shoulder, black and rust muzzle, quivering as it sampled his scent and found a truth it had been hungry for. The Rottweiler, broad as a short stack of oak, shifted last. It made a sound low in its chest that wasn't a growl so much as a question he knew how to answer. "It's me," he said, and the old steadiness returned to his voice like a friend who'd been waiting in the next room. "Michael, I'm here." He saw the collars then. Dull buckles, cracked leather, salt-stiffened holes from being cinched the same way too many times. Around each neck, where there should have been a tag with a name and a number and the promise of a call if the world went wrong, there was only the empty split ring shining faintly like a small metal moon. The absence struck harder than he expected. A tag is a lifeline in a place like Pine Hollow. Without it, a dog is a question mark on 4 legs. He reached, but did not touch until they told him it was allowed. That language learned in dusty lots and living rooms came back without effort. The tilt of shoulders, the set of a tail, the way a body leans into or away from a hand. The shepherd stepped forward and touched his knuckles with a cold nose, then stood very still as Michael laid his palm along the ridge of its neck. Beneath the fur he felt angles where there should have been breadth. He let his hand rest and counted to 5 the way his mother had taught him when he was a boy, trying to calm skittish horses at the county fair. The Doberman came in next, a nervous little dance in its feet, as if the muscles remembered speed and were startled by the idea of rest. The Rottweiler closed the distance last and tipped a great head against his arm with the kind of trust that never stops feeling like a gift. He took them in with his eyes because he needed to carry these details forward and test them against everything he had yet to learn. Fur matted in places a brush would have respected. Nails long enough to click on wood and scrape when turning. The faint threading of saliva at the mouth that says cold has been biting for more than an hour. He kept his breath even. Marines are taught a kind of stillness that can hide a storm. He used it now for a gentler purpose so he wouldn't spook the very beings who had spent unknown days learning how to be small on a porch that used to be theirs. He glanced past them to the door. No new wreath, no motion in the front window, no secondary light kitchen hallway television moving in the house like a pulse. His key hung on a ring in his pocket, worn oval in a way his thumb knew. He did not reach for it. Ownership and welcome are cousins, not twins. He took his phone out instead. There were old texts he could open. He didn't. There were calls he could make. He didn't. The thing about a homecoming is that it tells you what you need to know without anyone having to say it. A gust shouldered down the street, picked up grit, made the junipers hiss. The Doberman flinched and tucked against the shepherd. The Rottweiler put a splice of body between them and the open yard, an old habit resurfacing like a road under melting snow. Michael let the wind have its moment, and then took a breath that did the work of 3. "All right," he said, soft but sure. "We're not staying out here." He stood, and the dog stood, because that rhythm had not died. It had only gone quiet. He led them down the steps, not with a command, but a tilt of his shoulder and the memory of trust. And they followed in formation that had once turned heads at a township picnic. The truck door creaked a familiar complaint. He laid an old army blanket across the back seat, one more act of respect in a life that had taught him the difference between comfort and show. They climbed in with small sounds that told him as much as any report could: a contained whine, a heavy exhale, a rustle that ended in stillness. He started the engine. Warm air found them by degrees. He pulled away from the curb and checked the rear view out of reflex. The porch light hung behind them like a small star nailed to a blue house. He did not look for a silhouette in the window because he already knew this was not that kind of night. Pine Hollow thinned as he drove small businesses dark and buttoned down a mural on the feed store showing a harvest he now felt measured by. The highway ran like a black ribbon toward the cabin he'd rented for re-entry, a modest place off County Road 6 with a porch of its own and a heater he'd tested the first night, with a hand in front of the duct like a man negotiating terms. He glanced in the mirror again, not out of worry, but out of gratitude. The shepherd had taken the middle upright enough to watch as if claiming a post. The Doberman's eyes half closed, the kind of surrender that only arrives when a threat has moved a full mile behind you. The Rottweiler leaned so a sliver of weight touched the shepherd's shoulder, a habit once learned on long drives to the park, when summer was something you could smell before you saw. He found himself counting streetlights. He found himself listening for the small noises that map an animal's soul, the lick-swallow of thirst, managed the sigh that admits a day has been carried the only way it could be. He thought about names printed on aluminum and how easily they can be unhooked. He thought about the last time he had left this town, what he had promised these dogs, with a hand on each skull, a promise he had believed would be honored by those who said they loved what he loved. He was not yet angry. Anger is a storm, and he had learned to keep an eye on the sky. What he felt was a steadier thing, something like a plumb line dropping through the center of him until it found bedrock. The cabin showed itself around a bend, a single window lit to welcome no one in particular, the yard squared by a low fence that had kept deer out of a garden he would rebuild in the spring. He parked, cut the engine, and sat with the quiet. Then he spoke over his shoulder without turning, because sometimes trust travels farther when it doesn't feel cornered. "We're going inside," he said. "We'll get warm. We'll eat. We'll rest. Tomorrow we figure out the rest." The shepherd shifted, the Doberman lifted its head. The Rottweiler chuffed a small agreement. He smiled because the body knows how to register hope even when the mind refuses to put a name to it. He opened the door and the cold wrapped him quick and honest. He welcomed it. You do not make a plan for warmth without first acknowledging the air you are up against. When the three of them crossed the threshold. A minute later he felt something ease in his chest that had not eased in years. The door shut. The lock turned, and in the small click he heard the beginning of a vow he intended to keep. Michael stood still in the doorway of the cabin, his hand resting against the frame as if anchoring himself against the weight of what he was seeing. The 3 dogs he had once trained, loved, and promised to protect had followed him in, but their steps carried hesitation instead of joy. The German shepherd, taller and older, now moved first, but even he crept forward with the wariness of one who expects a hand to rise in punishment rather than welcome. The Doberman pressed close to his side eyes, darting every muscle strung tight like a bowstring, while the Rottweiler lumbered a step behind his bulk, betraying no confidence, but instead a guarded slowness that spoke of learned caution. This was not the reunion Michael had carried in his heart during long nights overseas, when memory was all he had. These were not dogs rushing forward with abandoned tails, whipping eyes alight. These were survivors, each glance up at him a test, each inch of movement toward him a gamble. He lowered himself carefully, crouching until his knees cracked, his palms open to them, the way a man approaches a fragile flame in the wind. He whispered their names, the syllables soft in the cabin air. And though each dog flicked an ear, none leapt forward. The shepherd finally closed the last of the distance, nose trembling as it reached his hand. But even then, his body remained tense, as though preparing to recoil at the slightest wrong move. Michael felt the tremor in that muzzle and realized it wasn't cold alone that shook him. It was memory pressed deep into muscle and bone. The Doberman followed, nudging against his arm, and then drawing back sharply as if startled by his own need for contact. The Rottweiler let out a deep breath, a sound heavy with fatigue, and sat just beyond the reach of Michael's fingers, watching, judging whether this man before him was still the one he remembered. Then something unexpected happened. The shepherd lifted his head, his eyes meeting Michael's in a brief searching glance before lowering his muzzle again. Something small dropped from his mouth into Michael's waiting palm. Michael looked down and saw it clearly in the dim light. A length of rope frayed at both ends, stiffened by dirt and damp. It was the kind of rope used to tie a gate, or worse, to tether an animal who was never meant to be free. The fibers rasped against his skin as he turned it over in disbelief. He knew what this meant. These dogs had not simply been left outside to fend for themselves. They had been bound, restrained, held in a way that broke trust as surely as hunger hollowed a belly. His chest tightened. He let the rope fall to the floor where it lay limp, mute testimony to what they had endured. The shepherd pressed closer, then leaning his head against Michael's shoulder with a weight that was both apology and plea. Michael wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close, his other hand reaching to stroke the Doberman's tense back, coaxing the younger dog into stillness. Slowly, the Rottweiler shifted forward, his large paws heavy on the wooden floor, and lowered his head against Michael's thigh. The contact was cautious, but once made, it did not break. He breathed them in, the scent of damp fur, old earth, neglect, and felt something inside him harden with quiet resolve. These animals had survived not by being cared for, but by learning to tread lightly, to silence themselves, to expect harm instead of kindness. That knowledge sat in the room with them like a fourth presence, invisible but undeniable. He guided them gently to the old blanket he had spread near the heater, a makeshift bed he had prepared out of habit more than certainty. At first they hesitated at the edge, glancing at him at each other at the door as though expecting to be shoved back into the night. He sat beside the blanket, not moving, not urging, simply waiting. Patience was a language they remembered, and eventually the shepherd stepped onto it, circling once before lowering himself. The Doberman slipped in next, curling tight, his ribs showing faintly with every breath. The Rottweiler stretched out last, his body a shield across the front, as though protecting the others, even in rest. Michael remained seated, watching them, his hand absently rubbing the coarse fibers of the frayed rope still on the floor. Questions pressed at him, heavy and insistent. Who had tied them? For how long? What had Rachel known, and what had she ignored? And most of all, why had none of those who lived close enough to see spoken up before tonight? He thought of the porch, the empty collars, the way they had approached him, not in joy, but in survival, and he knew this was only the beginning. The answers would not be gentle. But as the heater ticked softly and the dog's breathing deepened into something closer to rest, Michael felt the first ember of resolve kindle inside him. He would not let the silence of others decide the fate of those who had waited for him against all odds. Michael closed the door of the cabin behind him, letting the latch fall with a small metallic click that carried more weight than he liked to admit. He turned and expected the three dogs to gravitate toward the blanket he had spread or the bed he had left unmade in the corner, but instead they scattered in measured silence toward the farthest wall. The German shepherd eased himself into the narrow space between the dresser and the wall head, tucked eyes tracking every move Michael made. The Doberman slid under the table, curling into so tight a ball that his ribs lifted and fell in sharp angles against the dim light. The Rottweiler lowered his heavy frame beside the door, but angled his body not as one claiming territory, but as one bracing to be pushed back out. Michael froze where he stood, letting the picture of it settle into him. It was not defiance. It was resignation, the posture of animals who knew too well what came after they touched the wrong place. He crouched slowly, his hands open, his voice level and low, speaking names that once carried the weight of commands, but now he offered them as gentle invitations. None of them moved. He swallowed hard and understood then that comfort was not going to be granted simply because he had returned. It would have to be earned again, inch by inch. He took the towels he had left warming on the heater and carried them to the shepherd first. The dog's ears twitched, body rigid, as Michael laid the towel against his back. He pressed gently, rubbing slow circles to chase away the damp, the towel pulling water from the matted fur. As the coat dried, Michael noticed patches where fur thinned to reveal skin. He lifted the towel and his chest tightened. There, on the shepherd's flank, was a round mark puckered at the edges, the unmistakable remnant of a burn. He paused, his breath caught in his throat, his hand hovering as though the sight itself might wound further. He stroked gently over the scar, whispering reassurance, though the dog did not flinch. Now only lowered his head as if acknowledging the memory more than the pain. Michael shifted to the Doberman. The younger dog trembled when the towel first touched him, muscles twitching under Michael's steadying hand. He wiped down each limb, working from shoulder to paw, and when he reached the rib cage he felt a ridge beneath the fur. He parted the coat and found a long welt thickened over time, the mark of repeated blunt force. His stomach knotted. He thought of hands, boots, objects swung without mercy. The Doberman's eyes flicked to his, searching for reaction, and Michael forced himself to keep his face calm, his hands steady. He murmured quiet words about safety, about being home, words that meant nothing to ears tuned to tone, but everything to hearts attuned to consistency. The Rottweiler came last, his great body heavy against the floorboards. Michael knelt beside him, towel in hand, and worked through the thick fur, shaking out water that had collected at the base of his neck. When he lifted a fold of fur along the shoulder, he saw a scar that ran jagged like lightning, an old cut that had healed without care, skin stretched taut. He pressed the towel gently against it, wondering how deep it had gone once, and the Rottweiler exhaled a sound not of pain but of weary surrender. It was not the scars themselves that undid Michael. It was the pattern. Different shapes, different wounds, all telling the same story. This was not accident or misfortune. This was repetition, the steady erosion of trust inflicted day after day. He leaned back on his heels and let the towel fall across his lap. His mind shifted through memories unbidden the nights he had lain awake overseas, imagining them safe in a backyard he had built, their coats glossy under sun, their bodies strong from play. The contrast felt like a strike across his chest. He knew soldiers who said you cannot be surprised by cruelty, not after what men do to each other in war. But standing in that small cabin, looking at the bodies of those who had waited for him, he realized he was surprised. He had expected loneliness, maybe neglect. He had not expected scars that spoke of deliberate harm. He stood and folded the towels with deliberate care, setting them aside as though the act of neatness could offer structure to what had been broken. The dogs watched him, eyes following every move, but they did not rise from their corners. He opened the small cupboard and pulled out the provisions he had brought: rice beef trimmings, carrots. He filled a pot with water and set it to boil on the old stove, the hiss and pop of the burner breaking the silence. The shepherd lifted his head ears forward, nostrils flaring. The Doberman crept an inch from under the table, his paws sliding carefully. The Rottweiler thumped his tail once, a small drumbeat against the floor. Michael felt the shift. Food was language they understood, perhaps the only language left unbroken. He chopped the meat, the knife echoing against the worn cutting board, each sound pulling their eyes toward him. He stirred the pot, steam rising, scent of broth filling the cabin. By the time the bowls were set on the floor, the three had inched closer, hesitant, but drawn by memory as much as hunger. He placed the bowls apart, but within his reach, sat back on the bed and waited. The shepherd moved first, approaching with the discipline of one who still believed in order. He ate, but kept glancing back at the others, as if signaling permission. The Doberman darted forward, next snapping food quickly, then pausing to check the room before resuming. The Rottweiler lowered his head and ate slow, every movement deliberate, as if savoring not just the food, but the rare absence of threat. Michael watched them, not rushing, letting them dictate the pace. He took comfort not in the sound of eating, but in the silence between, the absence of fear in those pauses. When the bowls emptied, they did not scatter back to corners. Instead, they lowered themselves onto the blanket, the first step toward claiming space. Michael eased onto the bed, back against the wall, eyes never leaving them. He knew this was only the beginning. Scars do not vanish overnight. Fear does not dissolve in a single meal. But trust can be rebuilt, one act of patience, one offering of safety at a time. As the heater hummed, he let his hand fall to the wooden floor beside him. The shepherd's gaze followed it. The Doberman's ears twitched and the Rottweiler shifted closer by inches. They were measuring him as surely as he was measuring them. And in that quiet measurement, he recognized a truth: their survival had come at the cost of innocence, but not of loyalty. That still lived, waiting for proof it could breathe again. He glanced toward the window. The night pressed against the glass, cold and silent, a reminder that outside these walls the questions still lingered. Questions about who had done this and how much more there was to learn. He would find out. He would not stop until he did. The following morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of winter light that painted everything silver but gave no warmth. Michael stepped outside the cabin with a cup of coffee in hand, steam rising into the sharp air, and let his eyes sweep the yard. The three dogs moved cautiously across the frost-hardened ground, sniffing, testing boundaries, but never venturing far from the porch, as though the world still held too many sharp edges. He crouched, calling them softly, and the shepherd returned first, his tail held low but steady. The Doberman followed, ears twitching at every sound, while the Rottweiler lumbered behind, shoulders rolling like waves under his dark coat. Michael scratched each head in turn, his gaze drifting toward the line of trees that framed the cabin. The stillness unsettled him. This land was supposed to mean safety, yet silence could hide anything. Later that day, he drove into town to pick up supplies, feed heavier blankets, canned goods, and as he walked back toward his truck with bags in his arms, he caught sight of Mr. Howard, an older man who had lived 2 houses down from his old place on Maple Street. Howard lifted a hand in greeting, but then glanced around as if measuring who else might be near. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low, and asked, "You got those dogs with you?" Michael nodded, keeping his expression neutral, though his pulse ticked faster. Howard leaned in, eyes narrowing against the cold, and said quietly, "I saw something a while back. One night when they barked, some man came out, tall fella, sharp shoulders, and he kicked at your shepherd hard enough that I thought the poor thing would go down. It wasn't just once, either. I kept my head down, but I didn't like what I saw." Michael felt a coldness spread in his chest, deeper than the mountain air could deliver. He asked for details, but Howard only shook his head, unwilling to pin the man by name, just muttering that it wasn't right. With that, he tipped his cap and walked off, leaving Michael with the weight of words that felt like confirmation of what the scars had already told him. He drove back to the cabin slower than before, the supplies rattling in the passenger seat, his mind caught between images of loyalty and cruelty, colliding in a way he couldn't reconcile. When he pulled into the gravel drive, the dogs were there waiting, ears pricked, bodies alert, sensing his unease before he said a word. That evening he laid out dinner for them early, his movements deliberate, his tone calm, though inside he was tightening like a coil. He had spent years in places where danger rarely announced itself, and he recognized the feeling building in his gut, the sense of being observed. After the bowls were emptied and the dogs settled near the heater, Michael sat in the chair by the window lamp off room dim, watching the road through a narrow gap in the curtain. Hours passed in near silence, except for the shifting of paws against the floorboards and the occasional sigh from the Rottweiler. Then he saw it. Headlights glowed faint on the bend, the slow crawl of a vehicle easing into view. A black SUV, windows dark, rolling with a patience that did not belong to casual travel. It crept past the front of the cabin, tires crunching gravel, and though Michael sat in shadow, he felt the eyes inside the vehicle searching, weighing, trying to make sense of what they saw. The shepherd rose first, body tense, ears forward, a low vibration building in his throat. The Doberman followed suit, tail stiff, while the Rottweiler stood with deliberate weight, planting himself between the window and the others. Michael's hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingers steady, gaze fixed on the SUV. It slowed almost to a stop, lingered too long, then rolled on, disappearing into the darkness beyond the pines. Michael waited until the taillights had vanished before releasing the breath he'd been holding. He crossed the room, laid a calming hand on the shepherd's back, and murmured quiet reassurance until the growl subsided. The dogs eased back down, but their eyes remained on the door, as if they too understood that safety had just been tested. Michael sat back, his mind replaying Mr. Howard's words and the slow gaze of the man behind those tinted windows. This was not chance. The scars, the rope, the whisper from a neighbor, the vehicle watching from the road, each was a piece, and together they formed a pattern. He poured water into a mug and stared at the steam, his jaw set. He had not come home to fight another war, but sometimes a fight finds you anyway. He looked down at the 3 dogs, each of them watching him with quiet intensity, and he knew they were asking the same unspoken question he was. What comes next? The next morning carried a brittle quiet, the kind that hung over Pine Hollow when the wind had settled, but the cold had not yet given ground. Michael clipped the leashes to the collars one by one, the shepherd standing steady as always, the Doberman prancing in small, restless arcs, and the Rottweiler waiting with the patient weight of habit. They stepped out into the frost-dusted field beyond the cabin, the crunch of boots and paws marking their rhythm together. Michael let them lead, allowing their instincts to find a path, his own senses alert to the landscape. They moved along the dirt road, past fences leaning under years of snow, past a stand of cottonwoods that whispered faintly, even without breeze. The shepherd pulled forward, suddenly nose-low muscles taut as though catching a scent carved into the ground itself. Michael tightened his grip and followed as the shepherd drew him toward a clearing half hidden by brush. When they reached the open patch, Michael stopped cold. Before him lay a barren stretch of earth, its grass worn away in rough circles, the soil hardened by repeated pacing. Rusted metal stakes jutted from the ground like crooked teeth, each with a length of chain still attached. The ends twisted, some snapped, others locked shut. Around each stake, the dirt bore prints. Paw marks pressed deep, overlapping, restless, showing where animals had strained against their bonds again and again. Michael crouched, brushing his fingers over the cold links, the rust flaking to stain his skin red-brown. The Doberman whined, pulling closer, his body tense with recognition of a place that carried too many memories. The Rottweiler lowered his head and let out a sound from deep in his chest, neither bark nor growl, but a mourning noise Michael had never heard from him before. Michael's eyes swept the perimeter of the lot, noting the absence of shelter food bowls or even water stains on the ground. This had not been a play area. It had been a prison, plain and harsh. He turned slowly, orienting himself to the town's layout, and then his breath caught. Just beyond the sagging fence at the far end of the clearing rose a familiar outline. A 2-story house painted pale yellow with white trim, its windows squared like watchful eyes. He knew the roofline, the porch rail, the back door with its narrow screen. It was Rachel's house, the one they had once chosen together before the distance between them grew too wide to mend. Now it belonged to her and Eric, the man who had stepped into Michael's absence. The realization struck hard. The ground where his dogs had been chained was not a forgotten lot at the edge of town. It was the backyard's shadow, the place no visitor would see from the front drive. He stood there, heart pounding, piecing together the evidence, the scars under fur, the frayed rope in his hand, days before the neighbor's hushed account of a man lashing out. All of it pointed here. The shepherd's amber eyes fixed on the house body, stiff tail low but firm, a soldier at post. The Doberman pressed tight against Michael's leg, his sleek frame quivering. The Rottweiler lifted his head slowly, gaze steady on the back porch as though daring a memory to reappear. Michael felt the familiar discipline of the Marine Corps settle into his bones, the ability to stand still under pressure while the mind calculated. He considered walking up, knocking on the door, demanding answers. But timing mattered. To confront without proof was to risk everything. He let the leashes slacken slightly, guiding the dogs back toward the trail, though none of them moved easily. The shepherd glanced back again and again, unwilling to turn his gaze from the house. Michael murmured softly, coaxing them forward, his voice a low anchor in the brittle morning. They obeyed, but the weight of what they had shown him did not lighten. As they returned to the cabin, Michael kept his eyes moving, watching for the black SUV he had seen the night before, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The town might still look quiet. Its storefronts shuddered at smoke rising gently from chimneys, but beneath the surface he sensed currents shifting. Someone had done this to his dogs. Someone had chosen chains and blows where care should have been. And that someone lived in the house behind the clearing. When they reached the cabin, Michael unhooked the leashes and let the dogs settle near the heater again. He sat at the table, staring at the stain of rust on his fingertips, and felt a steady fire kindle. He had not come home looking for conflict, but the truth had placed itself in front of him like a line drawn across his path. He could no longer walk around it. He looked to the shepherd, who still sat upright, eyes on the window guarding even in rest. The message was clear. This was not finished. The decision to walk back to Maple Street came as naturally to Michael as breath itself. After seeing the chains and the barren clearing pressed against the back of Rachel's property, he knew avoidance would only let the wound fester. He leashed the shepherd, the Doberman, and the Rottweiler, each of them responding in silence, bodies taut as if they too sensed the weight of where they were headed. The streets were quiet, the cold air still carrying the faint tang of wood smoke houses buttoned down against the season. When they reached the familiar red-gabled house, Michael felt memories pressing close late summer evenings when Rachel had tended the geraniums on the porch, the laughter that had once lived in these walls. Now the light above the door burned without warmth, casting a flat glow across the steps. He climbed them with a steadiness that masked the storm inside. His knock landed firm, the sound echoing against wood and siding, and for a moment the silence inside seemed like refusal. Then footsteps approached and the door opened to reveal Rachel. Her auburn hair was tied back hastily, strands falling loose around a face thinner than he remembered. Her green eyes widened at the sight of him, a flicker of recognition and unease warring in them. She pulled her arms across her chest, posture guarded. "Michael," she said, her voice pitched too high. "I didn't know you were back." He held her gaze for a moment, then shifted slightly to reveal the 3 dogs standing behind him. "I found them," he said evenly, on the porch 2 nights ago. "No food, no shelter. Just waiting." Rachel's eyes dropped, her hands tightening at her elbows. Before she could speak, another voice drifted from deeper inside the house. "Who's at the door?" Eric stepped into view, tall and composed, his dark hair neatly. Cut his shirt fitted as though chosen for impression rather than comfort. His expression carried an easy confidence, lips curved in a faint smirk, as his eyes flicked from Michael to the dogs. "So," he said, "you must be the Marine." Michael did not move, did not flinch. "And you must be the one who thought chains were acceptable." Eric gave a short laugh, dismissive, and replied, "They're just dogs. Sleeping outside isn't a tragedy. Plenty of animals do just fine that way." Michael's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Not in freezing weather. Not these 3. Eric shrugged, tilting his head with casual arrogance. "Shepherd, Doberman, Rottweiler. They're hardy breeds. You're overreacting." The air thickened between them. Rachel shifting uncomfortably, Michael standing unmoved, Eric holding his smirk as though daring a response. It was then the shepherd stepped forward, body low stance, measured, placing himself directly between Michael and Eric. His amber eyes locked on the man inside, and from deep in his chest came a growl. Not the high bark of alarm, but a steady, deliberate sound that carried both warning and promise. The Doberman pressed closer to the shepherd's flank, his body trembling but resolute, while the Rottweiler lifted his head posture stiff, lending his mass to the line of defense. Michael laid a calming hand on the shepherd's back, his voice quiet but clear. "Easy," he said. "He hears what needs to be heard." Eric's smirk faltered, the muscles in his jaw tightening even as he tried to maintain his composure. Rachel glanced between them, her eyes reflecting conflict, guilt, fear, and something like desperation flickering beneath the surface. "Michael," she said quickly, "this isn't helping. You can't just show up like this." Michael did not look at her. His eyes stayed on Eric, unblinking, his words sharp without volume. "I came to ask one thing. Why were they out there? No food, no water, no roof to keep the snow off their backs." Eric's expression hardened, his smirk thinning into something sharper, but before he could respond, Michael gave the slightest tug on the leashes. "Come on," he said softly to the dogs. The shepherd backed away slowly. At first his body still angled toward Eric, the growl fading into silence, but the message left hanging heavy in the air. The Doberman followed, close tail tucked, but head held higher than before, and the Rottweiler lumbered last, his eyes steady on the door until Michael turned him fully. The three descended the steps with him, and the door closed behind them with a muted click that carried the weight of a line drawn. Michael walked them back through the quiet street, the winter air sharp against his face. He felt the tension in the leashes, the way the shepherd still looked back, unwilling to release vigilance. Michael's own heart beat steady, not with the rush of confrontation, but with the calm certainty that the truth was surfacing. He knew this was only the beginning. Words had been spoken, denials given, but the eyes of the dogs, the scars on their bodies, and the growl that had carried across that threshold told him more than any explanation could. As the porch light of Rachel's house faded behind him, swallowed by the dark, Michael understood that the fight ahead would not be one of raised voices alone. It would demand proof, patience, and resolve, but he had learned long ago that some battles are not chosen. They are accepted. And this one, for the lives that had stood beside him through silence and pain, was his to carry. The storm came without warning, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that rattled the tin roof of the cabin and bent the aspens until their branches scraped against each other in protest. Rain hammered the windows, lightning cracked open the sky, and thunder rolled across the valley like artillery. Michael sat at the small wooden table, pen in hand, trying to focus on notes he had been making about the dog's feeding schedule and medical needs, but every gust of wind pressed against the walls as if demanding entry. The shepherd paced near the door, restless ears flicking at every crash of thunder. The Doberman lay close to the heater, eyes open, body tense, while the Rottweiler stretched across the floorboards, steady but alert. Then came the moment Michael realized something was wrong. He counted instinctively, a habit from long nights on watch 1-2, but not 3. The Doberman's place by the heater was empty. He called out sharply, the storm swallowing his voice. The shepherd lunged to the door, barking once urgent, and Michael's chest tightened. He pulled on his jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and opened the door into the storm. Rain struck his face like cold needles, soaking through in seconds. The shepherd bounded ahead, the Rottweiler lumbering close behind, both pulling hard against the leashes. Michael let them lead, trusting their noses, his boots splashing through deepening puddles as he fought the wind. They veered toward the lake, the beam of the flashlight cutting across sheets of rain. The water churned wild whitecaps breaking against the muddy bank. Then the shepherd stopped abruptly, barking toward the reeds. Michael swung the beam and saw the Doberman. His sleek black and rust body was half submerged, tangled in a coil of wire strung tight against a root. He strained against it, water dragging at him, his paws scrabbling in panic. Michael dropped to his knees in the mud, heart pounding, and reached for the knot. The wire cut into his gloves, slick and stubborn, as though it had been twisted to hold. He spoke softly, despite the storm voice, steady words of reassurance carrying even as rain poured into his mouth. The Doberman froze for a heartbeat, recognizing the tone, then stilled just enough for Michael to work the wire free. With a final wrench it gave, and Michael pulled him to shore, cradling the shivering body against his chest. The shepherd pressed close, nose working over his brother's wet fur, while the Rottweiler stood guard his body between them and the open night. Michael rubbed the Doberman down with his jacket, checking each limb, finding raw grooves where the wire had bitten into flesh, but no deeper injury. Relief washed through him, fierce and immediate. But as he straightened, his beam caught something else. Just beyond the reeds lay a small clearing partly hidden by overgrowth. The rain had washed the ground clean, but scattered across the mud were objects that did not belong to storm or soil. A cracked plastic bowl, its rim chewed, a rusted collar buckle half buried, a length of rope stiff with age. Michael crouched, lifting them one by one, his stomach tightening. These were not the remnants of one night's accident. They were relics of repetition, evidence that other animals had been held here, tethered, abandoned when no longer useful. He turned slowly, sweeping the beam wider, and saw more the faint outlines of depressions in the mud, where bowls had sat in rows, the dark stain of waste in the earth, a lattice of paths worn by pacing paws. The storm lashed against him, but the chill came from within. This place was no accident. It was a holding ground hidden from the road close enough to the lake to wash away sound and scent. Michael felt the weight of it pressing against his ribs, a knowledge that his dogs had not been the only ones. He gathered the Doberman into his arms, the shepherd and Rottweiler flanking him, and made his way back through the storm. The cabin lights glowed faintly a beacon in the darkness. Inside, he dried the Doberman, carefully laying him by the heater with towels, whispering steady words as the other two pressed close to warm him. The storm raged on outside, but the room grew heavy with silence, the kind that follows discovery. Michael set the rusted collar on the table, its broken clasp catching the lamplight. He knew now that this fight was larger than 3 dogs, larger even than the scars already revealed. It was about a place built on neglect, a pattern of cruelty that would continue unless someone drew it into the open. The thunder rolled again, shaking the windows, but Michael barely heard it. His mind had already leapt ahead, tracing the chain of questions that demanded answers. Who had used this place? How long had it been going on, and how many more animals had suffered unseen? He looked down at the Doberman, finally dozing, his body still trembling in small fits, and then to the shepherd, who watched him with unwavering eyes, and the Rottweiler who settled at the door like a sentry. He knew what came next. Storms end, but evidence remains, and what he had found tonight would not be washed away. The morning after the storm, the lake lay quiet under a pale veil of mist, as though nothing violent had touched it the night before. Michael knew better. He had dried the Doberman until the dog's trembling eased, but the raw grooves left by the wire spoke of deliberate cruelty. Evidence mattered, not just memory, and he resolved to put what he had into the hands of someone who could speak with authority. That afternoon, he loaded the dogs into his truck and drove into town. The shepherd sat tall in the back seat, scanning the world through sharp amber eyes, while the Doberman leaned into the Rottweiler's steady bulk, still recovering from the night's ordeal. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of Pine Hollow, a whitewashed building with a blue sign swinging faintly in the wind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay, a mixture of medical precision and rural life. Laura Morgan, a woman in her early 50s with silver strands woven into her sandy braid, greeted Michael with the calm efficiency of one who had seen both joy and sorrow walk through her doors. She led them into an examination room, her voice low, soothing a tone that calmed the shepherd's restless pacing and coaxed the Doberman onto the table. Michael stood close, hands steady on each flank as she examined them one by one. Her fingers traced the burn scar on the shepherd's side, her eyes narrowing. She noted the welted ridges along the Doberman's ribs, the healed cut across the Rottweiler's shoulder. She wrote in careful script, her tone professional but edged with quiet anger. "These injuries are not from accident," she said, glancing at Michael. "They're consistent with long-term neglect and blunt force trauma. Someone struck these dogs again and again and left burns untreated. It will be in my report." Michael nodded, once his throat tight, grateful that her words carried not only knowledge but conviction. He felt the shepherd lean against his leg as though grounding him in that moment. After she completed the exam, she handed him copies of her notes, signed and dated, stamped with the seal of the clinic. "If you need testimony, I'll stand by these findings," she said simply. Michael thanked her, loading the dogs back into the truck with care, the weight of the papers heavy in his jacket pocket. Proof was building, but proof needed witnesses. Back at the garage where he had been working part-time, Bill Anders mentioned a name over lunch. "Carl Jenkins," he said, sipping coffee from a dented thermos. "Used to do yard work for Rachel and that fellow she's with. Quit last year. Said he couldn't stomach what he saw." Michael found Carl 2 streets over, trimming branches in his own yard. a wiry man in his late 40s with a face weathered by sun and long labor. Carl listened in silence as Michael explained why he had come, his hands stilling on the saw. After a moment, Carl wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and said quietly, "I saw him kick that shepherd of yours. Hard enough the dog staggered. Didn't stop there either. Chained the Doberman under the porch, left the bowl empty for days. I told him it wasn't right. He just laughed." Carl's jaw tightened, his eyes drifting toward the street as though replaying the memory. "That was the day I quit. Figured I'd rather go without work than watch that kind of thing again." Michael stood silent, the words striking deep, confirming what scars and whispers had already told him. Carl looked back at him, voice firm. "If you need me to say it to a judge, I will. I'll put it on record. Those animals deserve better than what they got." Gratitude surged through Michael, though he kept it contained, offering only a handshake that carried the weight of promise. The shepherd waiting at his side stepped forward to sniff Carl's hand-tail, lifting a fraction in quiet acknowledgement. Back at the cabin that evening, Michael spread the papers across the table, the veterinary report, Carl's written statement, his own notes on the clearing near the lake and the chains in the lot. The lamp burned low, the dogs resting nearby, but the room carried the quiet intensity of a command post. He felt the familiar calm of preparation settle into him. This was no longer about suspicion or memory. It was a case taking shape lines, connecting evidence gathering like storm clouds. He looked at the shepherd who lay near the door, ever watchful. The Doberman, now calmer, stretched beside the Rottweiler who rumbled softly in sleep. Michael knew that their survival was no accident. It was endurance, and now it was his duty to transform that endurance into justice. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of the town settling into night. But inside the cabin, Michael knew the next step had already been set in motion. The courthouse in Pine Hollow was a modest brick building that had stood for nearly a century, its wooden doors worn smooth by generations of townsfolk passing through to settle disputes, sign papers, or seek justice. On the morning of the hearing, frost clung to every railing and window pane, the town muffled in cold anticipation. Michael stood outside those doors, his suit pressed as neatly as a man of his means could manage, shoulders squared not from vanity, but from habit. The shepherd Doberman and Rottweiler were not with him. They waited at the cabin under Bill Anders' watchful eye. Yet their presence lingered in his every breath, a reminder of why he was here. Inside the courtroom carried the scent of old varnish and paper. The judge's bench stood tall beneath the state seal, and the pews held a scatter of locals who had come out of curiosity or quiet support. Michael took his seat beside Sarah Chen. The attorney Bill had connected him with her charcoal suit, sharp, her notes already aligned in precise order. Rachel sat across the aisle dressed in cream, her posture composed but her hands betraying nervous energy as they twisted in her lap. Eric sat beside her, his confidence wrapped around him like an expensive coat, his smirk faint but ever present. The judge Meredith Hayes entered with measured steps, silver hair swept neatly back, her gaze steady as she surveyed the room. Proceedings began, Rachel's lawyer rising first. He painted a picture of abandonment, describing Michael as a man who had left his animals behind when duty called, arguing that whatever condition they were in now stemmed from neglect at its root. Rachel lifted her chin and added, "He went away for years. They were left behind. I did what I could, but they were not my responsibility anymore." The words struck Michael like stones, though he kept his expression steady, his jaw firm. When Sarah rose, her voice carried the weight of measured conviction. She presented Dr. Morgan's veterinary report, reading aloud the findings of scars consistent with blunt force and burns untreated. The courtroom shifted with murmurs, the judge leaning forward slightly. Sarah then introduced Carl Jenkins, who spoke with quiet certainty of the day he had quit, describing how Eric had kicked the shepherd and left the Doberman chained under the porch. Eric shifted in his seat, his smirk thinning, but said nothing. Then came his mistake. When questioned, Eric leaned back, his tone casual but edged with arrogance. "I disciplined them the way animals need. I didn't hurt them." I just taught them in the way that was necessary." The judge's eyes narrowed at the phrasing. Necessary. It hung in the air, a word that carried more than he realized. Michael saw Sarah's pen pause in her hand, her mind locking onto the admission as if it were a flare in the dark. The room hushed, tension gathering like a storm. Then another piece fell into place. Sarah called forward Karen Ellis, a neighbor who lived across from Rachel's house. A small woman with steel in her gaze, she carried a phone that held the quiet power of proof. The clerk loaded the footage onto a screen, and the courtroom watched as the grainy video played. It showed Eric striding toward the 3 dogs, his posture sharp with irritation. The shepherd stood forward, body tense, guarding the others. The Doberman darted behind the Rottweiler, angled away. Then Eric's foot lifted clearly, aimed to strike, only to stop mid-swing when the shepherd's growl cut the air low and commanding. The video ended silence, settling over the courtroom, heavy and undeniable. Judge Hayes let the stillness linger, her gaze fixed on Eric, who now sat stiffly, the smirk gone from his lips. Sarah spoke into that silence. "This is not discipline. This is not care. This is cruelty met with defiance, stopped only by the instinct of a loyal animal. These dogs did not abandon anyone. They were abandoned, and worse, they were harmed." Michael sat motionless, but inside he felt the coil of tension loosen slightly. The truth was no longer his burden alone. It had been shown to all, undeniable, recorded, and witnessed. Rachel's eyes had fallen to the floor, her composure cracking while Eric shifted under the judge's steady stare. The rest of the hearing pressed on with legal formality, but the weight of those 2 moments, Eric's arrogant slip and the neighbor's footage, hung over everything like storm clouds about to break. Michael knew the outcome was not yet sealed, but he also knew the tide had turned. For the first time since stepping onto that porch weeks ago, he felt the ground beneath him tilt toward justice. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Meredith Hayes leaned forward, her glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose, her voice calm, but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. She began by recounting the evidence, presented veterinary records that confirmed prolonged abuse testimony from Carl Jenkins that spoke of first-hand cruelty, and the video recording that showed Eric attempting to strike one of the dogs, stopped only by the courage of the shepherd. Her words were deliberate, her tone leaving no room for ambiguity. "Custody of the animals. Rex, Max, and Duke," she said, her voice steady, "is awarded to Mr. Daniel Moore. Full rights without restriction. Furthermore, Mr. Eric Hale is prohibited from approaching within 100 yards of these animals at any time under penalty of law." A murmur rippled across the room, Rachel shifting in her seat. Eric stiffening as the weight of the ruling sank in. Judge Hayes continued, her gaze shifting toward Rachel. Additionally, as the property at 412 Maple Street was purchased prior to the marriage and was not transferred lawfully thereafter, ownership reverts to Mr. Moore. Effective immediately. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed like finality itself. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension that had lived in his shoulders for weeks releasing in a single breath. He did not smile, but a quiet warmth filled his chest, not of triumph, but of rightness. Sarah Chen gave a brief nod beside him. Her expression measured her satisfaction, revealed only in the faint narrowing of her eyes. Outside, the cold air tasted sharper, fresher, as though the frost itself had lifted. Bill Anders clapped him on the back with a grin, offering to help move his things from the cabin back into the house that was rightfully his. The drive that afternoon felt different. No longer a man in exile, Daniel returned to Maple Street not as a visitor, but as a guardian reclaiming his ground. The red-gabled house stood waiting, the porch light glowing faintly in the gray afternoon, no longer a symbol of loss, but of renewal. The dogs rode with him, the shepherd steady in the front seat, the Doberman alert in the back, and the Rottweiler leaning into the wind as though testing the air of freedom itself. The house smelled of dust when the door opened, silence pressing like a question. Daniel worked through each room, sweeping, scrubbing, airing out curtains, while the dogs explored cautiously, sniffing corners, nails tapping across the wooden floors. Bill hammered new latches onto the back gate, while Daniel repaired the porch rail. By evening, a fire crackled in the hearth, fresh straw lined the kennel outside, and the rooms carried not the mustiness of neglect, but the warmth of habitation. Dinner was simple beef stew simmered on the stove bowls filled for the dogs, who ate with quiet vigor, tails wagging not with frenzy, but with contentment. Afterward, Daniel settled into an armchair, exhaustion heavy, but welcomed the glow of the fire soft against the walls. The dogs gathered near him, the Rottweiler stretched closest to the heat, the Doberman curled tight but finally at ease, and the shepherd lying with his head between his paws, amber eyes still watchful even in rest. Then the shepherd rose, padding into the back room. When he returned, something small hung from his mouth. He approached Daniel, posture, steady eyes locked onto his master's face, and set the object gently into his hand. Daniel looked down and froze. It was a weathered collar tag carved from wood, its edges worn smooth, the faint engraving of a name still visible in the grooves darkened by years. He remembered making it in the weeks before deployment, shaping it by hand during long, quiet nights, sanding each curve, engraving the name Rex with the determination of a soldier who needed something to hold on to. He had tied it to the shepherd's collar as a symbol of loyalty, telling him it was a badge of their team. He thought it had been lost, but here it was carried, kept returned. Daniel turned it over slowly in his fingers, the firelight dancing across its surface. This was no memory brought back by chance. It was trust, carried through hardship, now given once more. He reached out, resting his hand on Rex's strong neck, his voice low. "We're home now," he said, the words steady, more oath than comfort. Max lifted his head briefly from his place near the hearth, ears flicking at the sound, while Duke shifted closer, his bulk pressing against Daniel's boots, as if anchoring him in the present. The fire cracked, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and outside the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the yard in silence. But inside, warmth reigned not only from the fire, but from the steady breathing of a pack restored. The scars of neglect remained etched into skin and memory, but they no longer defined the story. What endured was loyalty, courage, and a bond forged in trial and renewed in trust. Daniel leaned back, the wooden tag still warm in his palm, and let the moment settle. There would be challenges ahead, new routines work at the garage nights when memories pressed close, but they would face them together. No more chains, no more waiting on cold porches, no more silence where care should have been. The house was alive again, filled not with shadows, but with the sound of belonging. Thank you for staying with this journey from the cold porch of Maple Street to the warmth of a home reborn. If you believe no dog should ever suffer in silence, hit like, subscribe, and join us again. Drop a comment below. What scene struck your heart the hardest, and what city are you watching from today?